Welcome back, Deep Divers. We're going deep, deep down today.
hmm
Deeper than usual, even. We're not just looking at what we know or how we know it.
We're going meta.
Yeah, meta. We're diving into the philosophy of the philosophy of knowledge itself. It's metapistemology time.
Meta-epistemology, it's a mouthful, but it's really about examining those bedrock assumptions we make whenever we even talk about knowledge. Like, what are we even doing here? What are the rules of the game?
Exactly. Think about it. When you're scrolling through news, trying to decide if something's true, or when you're making a big decision and need to be sure you're not basing it on shaky ground.
You're running headfirst into these meta-epistemological questions, whether you realize it or not.
It's like we're going behind the scenes of knowing itself. And trust me, understanding this stuff can give you a real edge in navigating the world. It's powerful stuff.
It really is. So in this deep dive, we're going to explore two big, juicy philosophical areas. First, we're going to tackle the question of whether there are actually objective epistemic facts out there.
Right, so are there really hard and fast truths about what's justified, what's known, regardless of what anyone thinks? Or is it all kind of relative?
Like beauty being in the eye of the beholder. Yeah, we'll grapple with that. And second, we're going to put on our philosopher thinking caps and ask, what's the ultimate goal of analyzing knowledge?
Are we just picking apart the words we use? Or trying to understand our own concepts? Or is there something even deeper we're after, like the very essence of knowing itself?
We'll dive into all of that.
Okay, let's start with that first biggie, objective epistemic facts. This is where we bump into the classic philosophical battle between realism and anti-realism.
A bit like those big debates in ethics about whether moral truths are objective or just a matter of opinion, right? Metapistemology has a similar kind of showdown.
So let's be realists for a moment. What's the core idea of metapistemological realism? Paint us a picture.
Well, imagine a realist is saying something like, look, when we talk about knowledge, justification, rationality, all that jazz, there's a reality to it. There's something that makes those claims true or false.
And it doesn't matter what anyone thinks about it, right? It's like independent.
Exactly. Mind independent. It's out there in the world, just like the shape of the Earth. For a realist, whether you know the Earth is round isn't up for debate based on what folks believed back in Columbus's time.
Or what some folks sadly still believe, even with all the evidence.
Right. The truth of the matter is out there, regardless. And for a realist, it's the same with knowing something. It's not just a matter of opinion. There's a real distinction between knowing and just happening to have a true belief.
Okay, so for realists, when we argue about whether someone really knows something, we're not just disagreeing about preferences. We're disagreeing about whether some objective epistemic fact holds true.
And that means, importantly, that we can be wrong about what we think we know. We can be mistaken, even when we feel certain.
That's a humbling thought. And I think that realist view, the idea that there are right answers when it comes to knowledge, it often underpins how we talk about knowing in everyday life.
It's often the unspoken assumption. Yeah. Now let's hop over to the other side of the philosophical ring and put on our anti-realist hats.
So if realists think epistemic facts are independent of us, what do anti-realists say?
Well, broadly speaking, they'd say, hold on, epistemic claims aren't validated by some mind-independent world out there. But it's not as simple as that. There are different shades of anti-realism, different ways of pushing back against that realist picture.
Okay, walk us through those different flavors.
Sure. First, you've got some philosophers who go all in and say, you know what? There aren't any genuine epistemic facts at all. No objective truths about knowledge or justification. It's like they vanish into thin air. These are your hardcore non-cognitivists and error theorists.
Wow, that's a bold philosophical move. So for them, it's not just that those facts depend on us. They straight up don't exist.
Exactly. But then you have another group of anti-realists who are a bit more nuanced. They say, okay, maybe there are epistemic facts, but they're not floating out there in some objective realm. They depend on us in some way.
So our minds, our beliefs, our cultures, those things play a role in shaping what counts as knowledge or justification.
Right. You see this in positions like idealism, where the world itself is seen as mind-dependent, or in constructivism, where knowledge is seen as something we build or create. And then there's subjectivism and relativism, which also emphasize how our perspectives shape what's true for us when it comes to knowledge.
Okay, so even within anti-realism, there's a spectrum of philosophical views. Now, back on the realist side, are there any particularly interesting or nuanced developments worth highlighting?
Oh, absolutely. There are some real philosophical heavy hitters in this arena. One who stands out is Paul Bogossian. He's a staunch defender of a strong form of realism he calls absolutism.
Absolutism, eh? Sounds intense.
It is. One of his main targets is this idea he calls equal validity. It's the notion that there are all these different but equally valid ways of knowing the world, with science just being one among many.
So he's pushing back against those relativist tendencies we were just talking about, saying that not all ways of knowing are created equal.
Exactly. For Boghossian, there are objective epistemic principles out there, rules about what makes a belief justified. And these principles, he argues, apply to everyone. It doesn't matter what your background is or what culture you're from.
So a universal standard for rationality, essentially. And he thinks we can actually figure out what those correct principles are.
That's the heart of his absolutism. A strong claim, for sure. But it's worth noting, you could reject this equal validity idea without going full-blown absolutist.
So you could say there are objective epistemic facts, but maybe not one single set of them that applies across all possible worlds?
Right. There's room for philosophical nuance even within the realist camp. And speaking of nuance, another philosopher with a really intriguing defense of realism is Terence Cuneo. He takes a fascinating detour through morality to get there.
A philosophical road less traveled, for sure. How does that work?
Well, Cuneo's argument hinges on this idea that if moral facts don't exist, if there's no objective right and wrong, then epistemic facts can't exist either.
So he's saying our understanding of what's true about knowledge is somehow tied up with our understanding of what's true about morality.
Exactly. And since he's convinced that epistemic facts do exist, that there are right and wrong ways to form beliefs, he concludes that moral facts must exist too.
Okay, so he's using epistemology as a springboard to defend moral realism. What's his take on these epistemic facts themselves? What makes them tick?
Well, he sees them as prescriptive, meaning they give us reasons to believe things, regardless of whether we care about truth or rationality.
So it's not like if you want to have true beliefs, you should do X. It's more like you should do X, period. Full stop.
Exactly. It's a reason that applies to you as a rational being, whether you like it or not.
Interesting. And are there any other strategies philosophers use to defend realism?
Oh, definitely. Some argue for a kind of parity between morality and epistemology. They'll say, look, we already accept that there are objective moral facts, so why not epistemic facts too? Others take a more pragmatic approach, arguing that realism is just necessary if we're going to do epistemology at all.
Like, if there's no objective truth about justification, then what are we even debating when we argue about different theories of justification?
Right. It would be like arguing about the best way to get to a place that doesn't exist. Now, let's flip the script and wade into the anti-realist waters again. You mentioned earlier that explicit defenses of anti-realism are a bit rarer in metaepistemology than in metaethics. Why might that be?
It does seem a bit trickier to deny the existence of epistemic facts. It can feel kind of self-defeating.
Exactly. It's like you're using reason to argue that reason has no foundation. But that doesn't mean philosophers haven't given it a go. One way to do it is through metaepistemological error theory.
Error theory. Sounds a bit ominous.
It kind of is. It's the view that all our talk about knowledge, justification, and so on, it's just plain wrong. All those claims are systematically false.
So not just relative or mind-dependent, but actually mistaken. What's the reasoning behind that?
Well, some philosophers, like Jonas Olson, argue for a kind of parity with moral error theory. They say, look, if there are no objective moral facts, then it stands to reason there are no objective epistemic facts either.
A bit like Cuneo's argument, but in reverse.
Precisely. And then you have someone like Bart Stromer who goes even further with what he calls universal metanormative error theory.
Universal metanormative error theory. That's a mouthful.
It is, but the idea is pretty simple, actually. It says there are no objective normative facts at all. Not about morality, not about epistemology, not about anything. No objective standards for right and wrong, good and bad, true and false. It's a pretty radical view.
It is. But doesn't that run into problems? If there's no such thing as a good reason to believe anything, why should we believe error theory itself?
Yeah, that's one of the major criticisms. It seems to undercut its own justification. Plus, some philosophers, like Nishi Shah, argue that epistemic norms are just inescapable. Even when we try to argue against them, we're implicitly relying on reasons and evidence, which are themselves epistemic notions.
So it's like trying to jump out of your own shadow. You can't really escape those fundamental norms of reasoning.
Exactly. Now, another form of anti-realism is metaepistemological non-cognitivism, sometimes called epistemic expressivism.
Non-cognitivism. So does that mean they think epistemic claims are meaningless?
Not exactly. Instead of saying epistemic claims are false, like error theorists do, non-cognitivists say we're not actually trying to describe objective facts when we make those claims.
Okay, so what are we doing then? If it's not about stating facts, what's the point?
They'd say we're expressing attitudes or making commitments. Think about when you say, I want chocolate. You're not describing the world, you're expressing a desire.
Ah, so it's like saying, yay, knowledge, or boo, bad reasoning. Not, not making a factual claim about whether something really is knowledge or not.
That's the gist of it. It's about expressing approval or disapproval. Hartree Field, for instance, argued that a priori justification is more like a policy we adopt, not a matter of objective truth. And Mark Heller suggested that knowledge is just our way of saying someone's epistemic standing is good enough for practical purposes.
So it's less about whether a belief is objectively justified and more about our subjective takes on it. But wouldn't that make it hard to even argue for non-cognitivism?
Yeah,
Aren't you using reasons and evidence to make your case?
that's one of the big criticisms, yeah. It can seem self-refuting. Plus, it can be tough to figure out what non-cognitivists are even saying without assuming some kind of objective epistemic standpoint.
Right, like you need a shared framework to even make sense of their claims.
Exactly. Now, we've talked about those who deny epistemic facts altogether. What about those who say they exist but are mind-dependent?
Right, let's get back to those.
Hmm.
They say epistemic facts are out there, but they're somehow shaped by us.
Right. Yeah, there are different versions of this. You have idealism, which says it's all in the mind because there's no mind-independent world to begin with. It's kind of a radical view. But then there's relativism, which has been a hot topic in philosophy.
Relativism, yeah.
Yeah.
So the truth of knowledge claims depends on what exactly?
Well, there are different kinds of relativism, each with its own spin. You've got what's called explicitly relational relativism. It says something like, when we say evidence justifies a belief, what we really mean is that it does so according to some particular epistemic system or framework.
So different frameworks, different truths.
Right. You might remember Richard Rorty's famous example about Galileo and the church. He argued that both sides were right according to their own epistemic frameworks.
But if those frameworks are just out there, wouldn't that make the truths about justification objective again?
That's a common objection, yeah. Once you make the framework explicit, the truth is fixed relative to that framework. Not quite the free-for-all that some people associate with relativism.
So not so relative after all, maybe.
Maybe not. And that's why some philosophers, like John McFarlane, have proposed what he calls New Age relativism.
New Age relativism, huh? What's new about it?
Well, for McFarlane, the truth of knowledge claims isn't just relative to the context in which they're made, it's also relative to the context in which they're assessed.
Okay, give us an example.
Imagine you're driving through the countryside and you see a barn. You say, hey, I know that's a barn. Now, for a New Age relativist, whether that's true depends not just on the context of your utterance, but also on the context of whoever's evaluating that claim.
So if someone with really high standards for knowledge, maybe a philosopher obsessed with skepticism, were to assess your claim, they might say, nope, you don't really know.
Right. But someone in a more casual setting might say, sure, it's a barn. What's the big deal? The truth of the claim shifts with the assessor and their standards.
That's pretty different from contextualism, where the standards are fixed by the context of the utterance itself.
Right. For contextualists, once you say it, the truth is set, even if different people would assess it differently later on. For New Age relativists, it's more fluid. The assessor gets to call the shots.
Okay, so we've mapped out this whole landscape of realism versus anti-realism. Now let's zoom out a bit and ask, what's epistemology about at its core? What are we trying to do when we study knowledge?
This takes us to some really foundational philosophical questions about the nature of the whole field. You'll often hear epistemology defined as the theory of knowledge, but it's broader than that.
Right, we're also interested in justification, rationality, understanding, all sorts of things.
Exactly. It's less about any particular concept and more about, well, how do we make sense of our intellectual lives?
How do we know what we know?
Oh,
And how do we know that we know it? Those kinds of questions.
Exactly. Now, Ernest Sosa, a contemporary philosopher, makes a helpful distinction between what he calls gnoseology and intellectual ethics.
Gnoseology and intellectual ethics. Okay, break those down for us.
So gnoseology is all about evaluating those moments when we try to grasp truth. Think of it like an archer shooting an arrow.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Gnoseology is like analyzing the shot. Was it accurate? Did the archer use good technique? Was the bullseye hit because of skill or luck?
Ah, so it's about assessing the performance itself.
Right. Whether our beliefs are accurate, whether we're forming them competently, and whether the truth we hit is due to skill rather than just happy coincidence.
But that doesn't tell us whether the archer was aiming at the right target in the first place, does it?
Exactly. That's where intellectual ethics comes in.
So intellectual ethics is about choosing the right target.
Yeah, it's about deciding what questions to ask, what inquiries to pursue, given our limited time and resources. It brings in considerations of value and prudence.
So it's not just about hitting the target, but about choosing the right target to aim for in the first place.
And doing so wisely.
Okay, so for Sosa, we've got this two-level assessment. The nosological level, focusing on the accuracy and skill of our cognitive shots, and the intellectual ethics level, focusing on the wisdom of our choices about what to inquire into. And he's also got this interesting idea about the nature of inquiry itself, right?
Right. He points out that inquiry is all about putting ourselves in a position to make a knowledgeable attempt at answering a question. Once we think we have a good answer, the inquiry typically stops.
So inquiry is like the warm-up, the prep work. Once we form a belief, we move on from inquiry to assessment.
Exactly. Now, Sosa's not the only one with interesting things to say about the big picture of epistemology.
Right, you mentioned some other philosophers with different takes, like Linda Zagzebski, who comes at it from a virtue epistemology perspective.
Yeah, Zagzebski's view is that there isn't really a separation between nociology and intellectual ethics. For her, knowing is all about exercising intellectual virtues.
Virtues like honesty,
Right.
courage, those kinds of things.
Similar, but in the intellectual realm. Things like intellectual humility, open-mindedness, carefulness, love of knowledge. These virtues, she says, are essential to truly knowing.
So it's not enough to have a tree belief. You have to have formed that belief in the right way, with the right kind of intellectual character.
Exactly. And if your motives are bad, if you're driven by something like intellectual pride or a desire to manipulate others,
Then you can't truly know, even if you stumble upon the truth.
that's what Zagzebski would argue. It's a fascinating take, and it blurs the lines between epistemology and ethics in a way that Sosa's view doesn't.
For sure. And then there's Christoph Kelp, who puts inquiry front and center, right?
Yeah, for Kelp, epistemology is the theory of inquiry. It's all about how we ask questions and seek answers.
And he distinguishes between knowledge and understanding as the aims of different kinds of inquiry, right?
Right. When we ask what is X, we're aiming for knowledge. When we ask how does X work, we're aiming for understanding. And he has these really interesting network analyses of both knowledge and understanding, where he defines them in terms of their roles within inquiry, not in terms of more basic concepts.
So it's a less reductionist approach.
Exactly. Now, Jane Friedman offers yet another perspective, one that highlights some potential tensions.
Tensions between what and what?
Well, Friedman distinguishes between norms for believing and norms for inquiring.
So what we ought to believe versus how we ought to go about figuring things out.
Precisely. And she says these two sets of norms can clash. Sometimes what's a perfectly justified belief from a purely epistemic standpoint.
Might not be a good place to stop an inquiry.
Exactly. There might be zetetic reasons related to inquiry, to keep digging, even if you feel you've got a good answer.
So sometimes the pursuit of truth requires going beyond what seems justified at a given moment. That's really thought-provoking. It suggests that good inquirers need to be comfortable with a certain level of uncertainty.
And it raises questions about whether our standard epistemic norms might need some tweaking to accommodate those demands of inquiry.
Maybe we need to think more holistically about how believing and inquiring fit together.
Right. It's not as simple as we might think. Now, another big topic in metaepistemology is the relationship between belief and credence.
Belief, credence. Those sound kind of similar. What's the difference?
Well, think of belief as an all-or-nothing thing. You either believe something or you don't. Credence is more like a dimmer switch. It's your degree of confidence in something.
So I believe the sun will rise tomorrow, full stop. But I might have a high credence, but not absolute certainty, that it will rain later today.
Exactly. And the philosophical question is, which is more fundamental?
Yeah.
Which is the basic building block for our understanding of knowledge?
Are we fundamentally believers or credencers?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Right. And there are philosophers who lean towards eliminating one or the other. You've got folks like Richard Jeffrey and Richard Pettigrew who think credence is the way to go. They'd say belief is a messy concept that we can do without.
So they're team credence all the way.
Yeah, they think it gives us a more precise and nuanced way to represent our epistemic states. On the other hand, you've got Richard Holton, who's skeptical of credence and thinks belief is the core concept. But these eliminativist views are in the minority.
So what do most philosophers think?
Most fall into one of three camps. You have the belief-first folks, who say credence is just a fancy kind of belief. Then you have the credence-first folks, who say belief is just a really strong credence that crosses a certain threshold. And then you have the dualists who say, hey, why not both?
So they think belief and credence are both fundamental and irreducible.
Right, each playing its own role in our epistemic lives. Now, it's tempting to think this whole debate maps neatly onto the formal versus informal epistemology divide, but it's not that simple.
Right, you can have formal theories of belief and informal theories of credence.
Exactly. Scott Sturgeon has a helpful way of visualizing this with a 2x2 matrix.
A matrix,
Okay.
like red pill, blue pill.
Haha, not quite. But he basically says you can categorize epistemological work based on whether it uses formal or informal methods, and whether it focuses on coarse-grained attitudes like belief or fine-grained attitudes like credence.
So you could have formal, belief-based epistemology or informal, credence-based epistemology, and so on.
Exactly. And he points out that this matrix isn't even complete. There are projects that mix and match using both coarse-grained and fine-grained attitudes and combining different methods.
So the takeaway is that it's a complex and multifaceted issue.
Definitely. Don't let anyone tell you it's a simple either. Now, let's talk about how philosophers actually do epistemology. What are the methods they use to investigate these questions?
Right, we've been talking about the content of these debates, but what about the process?
One key debate is between Methodism and particularism.
Methodism, particularism. Those ring a bell. Remind me.
Well, remember those two big questions we talked about? What do we know, and how do we know it?
Yeah, the classic epistemological duo.
Right. Methodism says, start with the how question, figure out the criteria for knowledge first, and then use those criteria to figure out what we know.
So it's like develop a recipe for knowledge and then see what ingredients we have that fit the recipe.
Exactly. Particularism flips it around and says, start with what we know, look at clear cases of knowledge, and then try to work backwards and figure out what criteria those cases satisfy.
So look at the finished dishes and then try to figure out the recipe.
Precisely. And this leads to a classic philosophical chicken and egg problem called the problem of the criterion.
Which comes first, the criteria or the examples?
That's the dilemma. If you need criteria to identify knowledge, but you need examples of knowledge to figure out the criteria, where do you even start?
It's a real philosophical head-scratcher. So which approach has been more popular in recent times?
Particularism has been the dominant approach since the mid-20th century, especially after Gettier came along and shook things up.
Right, Gettier blew everyone's minds with those cases where you have a justified true belief, but it doesn't seem like you actually know.
Exactly. So philosophers started focusing on specific cases, testing out different criteria against our intuitions about whether those cases count as knowledge.
A more bottom-up approach, starting with the specifics. How does that contrast with earlier methods?
Well, philosophers like Descartes and Hume were more methodistically inclined. They'd start with what seemed obvious and build up a system of knowledge from there.
So more top-down deductive reasoning.
Right. But particularism has its critics. Some say it just assumes we already know stuff without justifying that assumption. And Methodism gets criticized for being arbitrary in its starting points.
Like, why pick those criteria to begin with?
Exactly. It's a tricky business, this whole methodology thing. Now, another methodological issue is the idea of analysis itself.
Right, you mentioned different kinds of analysis earlier. Some semantic, conceptual, metaphysical.
Right. Those are all different ways of approaching the classic philosophical question, what is knowledge? Often, philosophers try to provide an analysis in the form of S knows that P if and only if.
So they're trying to spell out the necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge, but what makes those different types of analysis distinct?
Well, semantic analysis focuses on the meaning of the words we use to talk about knowledge. They look at how we use knows in everyday language and try to extract its meaning from those patterns of use.
So it's a linguistic approach.
Yeah, like looking up knowledge in the dictionary of our language. Philosophers like Jason Stanley, Keith DeRose, and John McFarlane are often associated with this approach.
But isn't there a danger of getting bogged down in language? What if the way we talk about knowledge doesn't perfectly reflect the underlying reality?
That's a legitimate concern. The link between meaning and reality can be messy. So a big challenge for semantic analysis is to explain how those linguistic investigations actually tell us something about knowledge itself.
Okay, so what about conceptual analysis? How's that different?
Conceptual analysis is less about the words and more about the concepts those words express. It's about clarifying our thinking about knowledge.
So less about dictionaries and more about, I don't know, mind maps or something, trying to untangle all the different ideas that make up our concept of knowledge.
That's a good way to put it. Frank Jackson is a prominent advocate for this approach. He thinks philosophy is all about analyzing concepts, figuring out their essential features.
But doesn't that make philosophy sound a bit too introspective? Like it's just about our own thoughts, not about the world itself.
That's a criticism some philosophers have raised, yeah. Timothy Williamson, for example, argues that philosophers should be more like scientists, focused on the phenomena out there in the world, not just on our concepts about them.
So less about analyzing our mental furniture and more about getting out there and investigating the world.
That's Williamson's view. Now, metaphysical analysis takes that even further. It sets aside both language and concepts and looks directly at knowledge itself, the phenomenon in all its glory.
So what is knowledge? Really? What's its nature? What makes it real?
Those are the kinds of questions metaphysical analysis tackles. Ernest Sosa, in his later work, has been doing a lot of this kind of investigation.
So it's about getting at the essence of knowledge, what makes it tick. And metaepistemologically speaking, it's important to keep these different types of analysis straight, right? To know what kind of game we're playing.
Absolutely. And to think about how they might relate to each other. Does understanding the meaning of knows tell us anything about the metaphysics of knowledge? Does conceptual analysis help us bridge that gap? These are all meta-level questions worth pondering.
Okay, so we've covered methodism versus particularism and different types of analysis. Now let's talk about this up-and-coming field, experimental epistemology. How does that fit into the mix?
Experimental epistemology shakes things up by bringing in empirical methods from psychology and cognitive science. They actually do experiments to see how people think about knowledge.
So less armchair philosophy and more lab coats and data.
Exactly. And these findings can have big implications for traditional epistemology. For one thing, they give us a window into our intuitive, pre-philosophical understanding of knowledge.
Like, what do we naturally think knowledge is before we start philosophizing about it?
Right. And those intuitions can then be used to test philosophical theories. Do our theories match up with how people actually think?
So it's a way of holding our theories accountable to real-world data.
Exactly. And sometimes those experiments yield surprising results that challenge our philosophical assumptions.
Give us some examples. What kind of surprising things have they found?
Well, for example, there's been a lot of work on how the stakes of a situation affect our knowledge attributions. Early studies on this didn't always support the predictions of contextualism, which says that the standards for knowledge shift depending on how high the stakes are.
So our intuitions about knowledge might be less sensitive to practical concerns than some theories suggest.
That's what some of the research suggests. And then there's been work on those classic Gettier cases. Some studies have found that the Gettier intuition, that gut feeling that the person in the case doesn't really know, even though they have a justified true belief.
Right, that classic philosophical aha moment.
Well, some studies suggest that intuition might not be universal across cultures, which is fascinating because it raises questions about whether those intuitions are reliable guides for building our theories. And maybe even more surprising, there's been research on those fake barn cases.
Fake barns. Remind me what those are about.
It's where someone forms a belief about a real barn, but they're in an environment where there are lots of indistinguishable fake barns.
So their belief is true, but it could easily have been false if they'd been looking at a different barn.
Right. And a lot of mainstream theories say you don't know in those cases because your belief isn't formed reliably. But experiments often show that people are more willing to attribute knowledge in those cases than those theories would predict.
So our ordinary intuitions about knowledge might be more forgiving than our philosophical theories.